Hi, everyone. There's so many of you here. First of all, I want to say thanks to Jordan and Michael for inviting me to speak, and thanks to all of you for coming. My name is Kevin Yank, and I'm going to show you 4 things that almost no one knows about CSS. First, by way of a bit of introduction, CultureAmp is my employer. We're actually located right upstairs. I wouldn't be surprised if my desk was immediately above my head as I'm standing here. But it's kind of exciting for me to be speaking at 99 Designs tonight. Not many people know this, but I'm actually the mayor of 99 Designs on Foursquare. No, but seriously, I worked for a place called SitePoint, and I was on the team that built the very first thing that eventually became 99 Designs. So getting to speak here tonight is kind of nostalgic for me, and it's really exciting. Actually, SitePoint didn't have a logo this nice back then. It actually looked like this. And I'm only doing this because the designer of SitePoint over all this period is actually sitting in the front row, my friend Alex Walker. Just to extra embarrass you, this is actually the original SitePoint logo. Those are actual pixels, people. Did you design this, Alex? Yeah. Look. This has nothing to do with my talk. I just love how the web now has a retro look all its own. The black stroke, the drop shadows. Get a load of that embossed circle, people. This is retro web, and I love it. We should go back to that. But anyway, somewhere between working for CultureAmp and working for SitePoint, I helped build this thing called Sit the Test, which is a website. You can visit it, and you can take online tests. You can also create online tests, but we're here to talk about this one test that we made called CSS Core. We figured we would create an easy CSS basics test that anyone could come and try out our platform and test their CSS knowledge while they were there. It was supposed to be an easy test, but the average score is 55%. This is based on the first 3,000 people who took the test in the first half of this year. So people who actually care enough about their CSS knowledge to come take a test, see it through to the end, we're still only getting 55%. This test is basically just basics of CSS 2.1. There might be a couple of CSS 3 things in there, but this is basic stuff. I'm not talking about the finer points of Flexbox here. This is what we consider the fundamentals of CSS. And at SitePoint, this is what we call evergreen content. It's the stuff that is always going to be relevant. There are always going to be people who need to learn it. And so it's especially important that we, at meetups like this, talk about these things now and then. So this stuff never gets old. And I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes or so going through the 4 worst answered questions on this test. I am open to the argument that they're the 4 worst answered questions because they're the 4 worst written test questions. For the record, I wrote this test. So if you don't like how these questions are written, I'd love to hear your feedback. But let's dive right in with the first one. How best to set line height? So hopefully this is an easy one for anyone who does text styling on a regular basis with CSS. We're looking for double-spaced text on our page, and there's 4 ways to do it. Which is the best one? Can I get everyone to raise their hands? Everyone. So take a second, read the question, pick your answer, and when you're happy with the answer you've got, lower your hand. All right. So let's dive in with the first wrong answer. Oh, by the way, 31% of people get this right on the test. So don't feel bad if you get it wrong. You're in good company. Double is the red herring on this one. Double is not even a valid value for line height. The only keyword that line height accepts is normal. So double's no good. Fortunately, let me just check. Double, only 9% of people chose that. The next one, the one that was really popular, is 2M. 39% of people choose 2M on this question. And indeed, it will give you double-spaced text. But so will 200%. In fact, for line height, 2m and 200% are exactly equivalent. So there's no reason you would choose one or the other, except that I guess m's are more in vogue at the moment. But there's no real benefit to one over the other when you're talking to line height. And only 21% of people liked 200%. So the correct answer that leaves us with is 2. And only 31% of people got that correct. So let me explain to you why this is the correct answer. This is something that it was drilled into me when I was first learning CSS, probably from some O'Reilly book. You should always specify line height as a unitless number. That way, descendant elements that specify a different font size will inherit that number rather than a fixed line height. Let me show you what this means. I've got a web page with some text and a heading in it. The text is 12 points. The heading is 24 points. If I specify a line height of 1.2m, or 120%, that gives me a line height of 14.4 points. But the heading, by default, will inherit its line height. And what it will inherit is that same 14.4 points, which is not that great on a 24-point font, which is why the text is crushed together there. This is what we're trying to avoid. You could fix it by setting a line height of 1.2m, but then you're repeating yourself all over your style sheet. So we'd prefer not to do that. Instead, if you set a line height of just 1.2, no unit, that still works out to 14.4 points, but the value that's passed forward to descendant elements is the 1.2, the number, the ratio. And so what that works out to on the heading is the 28.8 points that we're after. Remember this line you don't have to write because it's implicit. It's the default. And so that's why we prefer unitless numbers for line height. That was the easy one. And there's the answer. Next one. This one's a bit trickier. It calls for some knowledge of the dirty hacks that are needed for CSS layout, especially in a pre-Flexbox world. Which of the following CSS properties used by itself can cause HTML elements to overlap? Raise your hands and lower them when you've got your answer. Okay, that's everyone. So hopefully no one fell. Oh, by the way, we're down to 30% now of getting this right. Background, again, was the red herring, and very few people fell for this, only 2%. Background, of course, controls your background images, your background colors. It has nothing to do with overlapping elements. The one that everyone steers into, unfortunately, is Z-index, and 46% of people choose Z-index. The key here is used by itself. If you use Z-index by itself, it actually doesn't do anything. You can set Z-index on all your elements, and it won't do a thing unless you also set position. Any position value apart from the default will bring things like Z-index to life. But yeah, by itself it does nothing. And even when it is active, all it does is control the stacking order. By itself, it won't cause things to overlap. If you're wondering how Z-index works, I believe the reason everyone chooses this answer is no one understands how Z-index works. And the Mozilla Developer Network has this great article, Understanding CSS Z-index. It's a great read in an afternoon, and by the end of it, you will understand something that most people don't understand about CSS. And that's a fun feeling to have, so I recommend it. Getting back to the question, overflow, hopefully it was easy to eliminate. We got 22% of people with that. Overflow controls how the content of a box behaves when you size that box to a specific size, whether the content flows out over the edge if it's too large, or whether it gets chopped off, or several other options. Again, we're looking for an element that's a property that's used by itself, and if you don't use other properties to size a box, overflow is not going to do much for you. So the correct answer is margin. And if you got this wrong, you might be wondering how on earth a property that is designed for creating space between elements could cause them to overlap. Anyone want to venture a guess? Negative margins, that's right. So negative margins make things overlap. This is really easy to show. If you have two divs and you set a negative top margin on the bottom one, zoop, it covers the bottom 100 pixels of the one above it. That's how you overlap things using just margins. That's not an especially useful technique by itself, But I often use negative margins to push HTML elements into places they wouldn't normally want to go. So for example, if I put right padding on this outer box, then the floated box inside it, I can push it into that padding space using a negative margin. And this kind of stuff is useful all the time. CSS old-timers will know that things like the first 3-column layouts that really worked reliably were done mostly using negative margins and floated elements. So the correct answer there was margin. This is number 3, pseudo elements versus pseudo classes. This is a bit of a cheap shot, I'll admit. Only 23% of people get this right. To boil it down, there's 4 different visual effects you might want to do. 3 of them are done with pseudo classes. I want you to pick the one that is done with a pseudo element. Raise your hands and lower them when you're happy with your answer. A lot of people lower their hands but keep reading. All right, so here's, to boil it down for you, this is what you need to know to answer this question right. A pseudo class is a state in which an actual HTML element can find itself. It's like a virtual class that the browser applies to that element for you, so you can style it when it's in that state. A pseudo element is a part of the document that CSS lets you style even though it's not an HTML element. It's like a virtual element that the browser creates in the document for you so you can style it. So is it a virtual class or a virtual element? That's what you should be thinking to tell these apart. So let's go through the answers. Adding a drop shadow to a hyperlink when the user hovers their mouse over it. 22% of people thought this was a pseudo element. Well, a hyperlink is an actual HTML element. And the mouse hovering over it is a state in which it can find itself. So this is a pseudo class we're talking about. Anyone know which one? It's hover. It's probably a really popular pseudo class anyway. And so yeah, you just style the hover pseudo class of link and you get this effect. That's a pseudo class. Display the label of a checkbox in a different color when the checkbox is checked. This one's a bit tricky. 20% of people thought this was correct. But a label is an actual HTML element, so is a checkbox for that matter. The checkbox being checked is a state in which it can find itself. So once again, we're talking about a pseudo class. The tricky bit here is the element that we are styling and the element that has the pseudo class on it are actually 2 different elements. But you can do this with an adjacent selector. The checkbox being checked when it has a label next to it, style that label. That's a pseudo class as well. Given the even and odd rows of a table, different background colors. So this is 36% chose this one. This is the one that really fooled people. This is the bit of CSS3 that I was talking about. But table rows still are actual HTML elements. Them being even or odd in their parent element are states in which they can find themselves. So once again, we're talking about a pseudo class. This is the nth child pseudo class, which you can style even children or odd children with using these 2 approaches. This is a CSS3 feature. And I reckon because nth child seems mysterious and pseudo elements seem mysterious, people must figure they're the same thing. But it's not, it's a pseudo class. So that leaves us with the correct answer. In a flexible page layout, display the first line of a paragraph in bold text. The first line of text in a paragraph isn't an HTML element. It's the browser that decides how the text wraps. So there's no start and end tag that corresponds to the first line of a paragraph of text. And that's why we need the first line pseudo element to style it. This is a pseudo element. Anyone else know any pseudo elements? Care to venture a guess? Before and after are really common ones. We use those all the time. Content is not one of them. It's not on my list. No, content is how you might create some generated content in CSS by adding the content property to the before pseudo element. But anyway, there's first letter, selection to style the actual text selection. And there's one called backdrop that's experimental. It has to do with creating backdrops for light boxes. I've never used it, but there you go. Anyway, if you think that that was a cheap shot because no one knows the difference between pseudo classes and pseudo elements, the W3C seems to agree. They're actually trying to change, they've been trying for a while to change the syntax. So the pseudo elements get 2 colons, and pseudo classes get 1. In practice, browsers need to be backwards compatible, so everyone writes these with single colons anyway. So I don't know how successful this is going to be at creating a distinction, but it's a real thing. Last question. This is the one that almost no one gets right. How do you calculate percentage margins? That's what it boils down to. Let me show it to you here. If we have a container div, and inside it we have a content div, and then we set a top margin of 10% on the content div, what does that 10% refer to? 10% of what is the question? I love this question because it seems like the answer should be so obvious. I reckon a lot of people just guess and figure they're going to be right, and they get it wrong. So I'll show you the actual question, because it might not seem that obvious until you realize this is a multiple choice test. So are we talking about 10% of the content div's height, 10% of the container div's height, 10% of the content div's width, or 10% of the container div's width? So if you're looking closely at those answers, you'll realize you have 2 decisions to make here. Are we basing the margin on the content div or the container div? And are we basing it on its width or its height? Let's take those in turns. But before we do, 13.8% of people get this right. And if you're among them, congratulations. Yeah, well, that is less than chance. You'd expect 25% to get it by chance. So people are actively choosing the wrong answers here. So container or content? Is the size of the top margin based on the size of the content div, the blue one, or the size of the container div, the green one? This isn't a gimme, but you can probably go with your instincts. If you've got a box that's 50% of the width of the page and you add 25% margin on either side, that adds up to 100%, and you would expect it to fill the full page, and you'd be right. So we are talking about a percentage of the container div here, and 2/3 of people get that part of the answer correct. But that brings us to width or height. Is the size of the top margin based on the width or the height of the container? If you've been paying attention, you're probably on your guard. You're realizing this is a trick question, and yet you can probably barely bring yourself to believe that that top margin is based on the width of the container. It is. And only, well, 79% of people get it wrong, which leaves us with 21% that get this part of the answer right. So if you don't believe me, well, there's the breakdown, by the way. So the answer is 10% of the container div's width is how we calculate that top margin. If you don't believe me, here's the quote from the W3C. The percentage is calculated with respect to the width of the generated boxes containing block. Note that this is true for margin top and margin bottom as well. They know it's crazy. That's why they put the extra sentence in there to explain it. So at this point, you're probably thinking the people who made the box model are either insane or they made a huge mistake. But I'm here to tell you that this makes sense. And I've got 2 reasons why. First of all, horizontal and vertical consistency. We all know that there is a single margin property that lets you set the margin on all 4 sides at once, and that expands to this. And in a world where the vertical margins are based on the height of the container and the horizontal margins are based on the width of the container, you'd get something like this, where that's 10% of the height and that's 10% of the width. But that's not what you expect if you set margin 10%. You expect even margins all the way around. So that's one reason why they might have picked the width and just gone with that for all margin percentages. The other reason is avoiding circular dependency. Put yourself in the position of a web browser trying to lay out a page. We've got a div with another div inside it, and we tell the browser to add a 10% margin to the inner div. And if this is a world where that 10% is 10% of the height, Well, I've just added 10%, but in so doing, I've changed the height. So I actually also need to add 10% of the change, and 10% of that, and 10% of that, and so on. And what we've got here is an infinite loop in our page layout. And browsers don't work well when they have infinite loops in them. So this is another good reason why we pick width, which is fixed no matter what the content of the box is, as our source for the percentage.
Wait, how would that work for width?
Well, because boxes, the question was how would that work for width? Because boxes stack vertically on the page, and the only thing that changes about a box when you add more content to it is its height. Its width can be calculated with no knowledge of its content. And they've done that on purpose so that they can do things like this that make layout possible. Inline elements are a whole other matter. We could have a whole other conversation about that. But I think I've used up my time, so that's it. At this point, if you feel like taking the test, you should visit the site. Having seen these answers, you are at a distinct advantage over anyone else who would take this test. And I'm actually in the market for some new hard questions for this test. So I'd love to hear if you have any thoughts. There's 2 articles here that I wrote breaking down these questions and their answers as well. And Culture Amp right upstairs is hiring. If you got all these answers right and you also know a bit of JavaScript, I'd love to talk to you. But that's it. Thanks.